Good morning, everybody. We have any dads in the room? Here's one you can take back. So after a round of golf in Scotland, 3 golf clubs went to a pub, and the putter went up and said, "Hey, bartender, I'd like a pint." And then the wedge went up and said, "I'd also like a pint." And the bartender went to the 3rd club and said, "What do you want?" He says, "I just want a glass of water." He said, "A glass of water? I'm the driver." So, I'm Scott Widham. I'm with Layer 7 Capital. We're a boutique investment bank headquartered in New York. We do digital transformation and digital infrastructure. But according to Kenny, I guess digital transformation is going the way of the dodo bird, so we may have to rethink our strategy. We do buy-side, sell-side advisory work, and we also raise equity, debt, and what I'll call dequity for companies that are in this room, frankly. I've been in the digital infrastructure space for a long time, maybe too long, but have enjoyed it. Have been able to buy undermanaged, undermarketed assets over the years, and then by putting together a management team and a strategy, using private equity or infrastructure capital and debt, improve those platforms over a 3 to 6 year period and sold them off. And thus far, they've all been good ones. But I'll tell you, turning around companies is a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, it's 60-hour weeks. It's sacrificing a lot of things. So I recently went to the dark side, to iBanking, because I think this is a good next chapter for me. The technology in this industry continues to evolve, and I've seen a lot of that over my 45 years in the business. I started off in the circuit switch business, and then moved to coax, and then we went to hybrid fiber coax, and then to all fiber, and then to dense wave division multiplexing, where you can take a light and turn it into 1,120 different colors. And then we went to passive optical networks, and that went to gigabit passive optical networks, and now we have XPON. So I don't know where XPON came from. Maybe Elon bought it and renamed it. I'm not really sure. But the one thing that's consistent, unlike technology, is M&A activity. We continue even in 2024 to see big deals. As Kenny talked about, we saw the Unity Windstream merger for $13.4 billion, T-Mobile and US Cellular for $4.4 billion, T-Mobile teaming up with KKR on Metronet for $4.9 billion, and T-Mobile acquiring Lumos for almost, with EQT for almost $1 billion. So a lot of T-Mobile in there. I think you all would agree. But now as we're ending 2024, we have a lot of things going on. An election year, a lot of geopolitical strife, an uncertain economy, interest rates, who knows where interest rates are going. So I think right now, if the panelists would just introduce themselves and their companies and maybe give a view as to what you think is going to happen as we go into 2025.
Appreciate it. Jason Adkins, I'm the CEO at Bluebird Fiber. We are a fiber company, business to business, no residential, mostly in Missouri, Illinois, Kansas, a little bit down into Oklahoma. I've been on board here about 8 months, so the Bluebird itself is 25 years old, so it's interesting, as Scott said, coming into a company that has a very distinguished, good past of serving the Midwest with great fiber connectivity, and then just kind of charting where to go to the future. In a nutshell, lots going on in the industry, and I'm sure we'll get into that. We have to kind of watch what the wireless guys are doing, what the hyperscalers are doing. Kenny mentioned a lot of that in his talk earlier. So leaves a lot of white space open to consolidate businesses and do other things that are very interesting. So.
That's great.
Ryan Carr, I'm a partner with MC Partners, which is a lower middle market private equity firm that invests in digital infrastructure and tech services. We're currently investing out of our 9th fund around those 2 spaces. We have relative investments in founding companies like Zayo, Light Tower on the enterprise fiber side. We've got 3 residential broadband platforms that are focused on MDUs, and also invest in data centers and towers. In terms of the kind of 2025 outlook, similar to Jason and some other folks out here, I think probably 2025 is going to be a year of a lot of consolidation. I think we've seen a lot of investment over the last few years, and especially on the residential broadband side, and expect to see some of those start to consolidate.
I'm Chad Crank. I'm a managing director at Grain Management. We're an investor in this space, broadly defined. We don't really consider ourselves infrastructure investors or private equity who cross the lines. Against those, we have flexibility to invest in things that look more like infrastructure, more like private equity, more like on the debt side. But we are narrowly focused on this space, broadly defined. So we have fiber assets. We've got 6 different fiber operating platforms, mainly in the U.S., but also internationally. We've got tower platforms. We've got data centers. We own a bunch of wireless spectrum, which is our angle on the carrier side of things, managed service providers, and then actual services, companies that support the ecosystem. So everything that we do is very narrowly focused on effectively the thesis that we as a society, we as companies are addicted to broadband. We're going to continue to be, and we're going to play that thesis on different elements of that ecosystem. So that's how we play it. We've got about $10 billion assets in the space in those areas. And similar theme. I think it's to some degree. I don't want to get over dramatic about it because it's more of the same, right? I mean, it's more of build out fiber, build out assets across the country. So there's a build cycle going on, but then there's also a consolidation cycle going on. That's been pretty tepid the last 2 or 3 years. We're starting to see it heat back up a bit, and I think it'll be even more active in 2025, but it'll be more of the same going on throughout that time period.
And Chad, I noticed that your boss, David Grain, was honored last night in New York for entrepreneurialism, and a number of your coworkers stayed in New York and won't be until later today, but we're happy you're here.
Yeah, great. Happy to be here.
Very good. James Henry, I'm a Senior Managing Director with Bank Street Group. Bank Street is a boutique investment bank. We define ourselves by sector focus as well as product specialization. From a sector perspective, we live 100% in what we call communications, infrastructure, and services. So fiber networks, data centers, towers, and related wireless assets, the companies that deploy them, operate them, develop them for the delivery services. On the product side, we offer M&A advisory, both buy side and sell side, private placements of debt, equity, mezzanine capital. We have a restructuring practice that has been somewhat quiet given the buoyant enthusiasm for this sector over the past decade, but is actually seeing some interesting opportunities there. Ultimately, the distinguishing characteristic of Bank Street is the 1-2 punch of deep domain expertise in specific industry verticals with really top-flight transactional talent around M&A and capital markets deals. We've been highly active in this ecosystem. Some of the deals mentioned here, Bank Street advised on, including the reunification of Unity and Windstream. We were advisor to Lumos and EQT on the T-Mobile joint venture. We were advisor to Metronet on the KKR T-Mobile joint venture. So we've been woven into this ecosystem very actively. I think we have a front row seat, maybe a driver's seat in terms of what's coming. And I would agree with Chad. It's more of the same looking forward to 25, but it's also different. What investors want is different. This is about customers and cash flow, not about construction and capacity. It's about combinations as opposed to just funding raw growth. So there's some subtle differences, but also some very important ones that we can unpack during this dialogue.
I like the way you broadly define this industry as satellite, broadband, fiber, cable, et cetera. What technologies do you think are most at risk as these technologies tend to become disruptive to other businesses? Anyone?
I guess I'll take a stab at it. Look, I mean, well, is it unfair to say copper? Is that too easy? Look, I think we are across this panel big believers in fiber. No doubt fiber has a superior access medium in terms of sheer amount of capacity you can get per dollar of capital invested, and in theory should be infinitely scalable over time. But you also can't count out cable. The amount of capacity that they've been able to squeeze out of these HFC networks from DOCSIS 1 to 2 to 3.1 to 4.0 is remarkable. And you can't count out the cable companies as scale competitors either. So they're formidable. And I think fixed wireless to us has a place, right? There's a transitory place in some markets and a permanent place in others. The rural remote. So I think it's not so much that there's a single technology or single underlying access medium other than copper that is obsolete or going obsolete. It's you have to find the right use case, the right end state for each of them. But I think over time you're going to see a lot more fiber as a percentage of total.
Agree with all that. I guess I would touch on the fixed wireless side of that equation. If I think about kind of losers in the space, I would say the traditional, and if I think about fixed wireless, I could have separated out between the big carriers, AT&T, T-Mobile, et cetera, Verizon, and then these independent providers that are out there. And I think they were already in a tough spot. We've had a pretty negative view on them for years. But I think the last year, 2024, is a really tough year for them because I think we've signaled now that it's going to go this other direction, and that those ecosystems are not very compatible from a technology perspective, and they're going to get left stranded. So I agree, transitory, but like really quickly transitory.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think as you think about fixed wireless, at least how we view it, it all comes down to what is the end user experience and what bandwidth can they take down. And if you can provide a 1 gig service symmetrical on a fixed wireless product, you're going to have longer staying power. Again, it's not necessarily going to be a forever technology. There will continue to be upgrade cycles that are required. But to the traditional rural fixed wireless, I think that's going to be a really tough play, especially as you see, BEAD, BOOT, et cetera, all these different federal programs get rolled out. If they're not participating in those programs and trying to overbuild their own networks and take advantage of that, somebody else is going to do that, and I think that puts them under a lot of strain and pressure.
Yeah, I mean, fiber always wins at the end of the day, but frankly, as a taxpayer, fixed wireless, Starlink, all those spots, all those different technologies have places in sort of the broadband ecosystem because, right, if you choose to live on the side of a mountain somewhere, 11 miles from the closest, fiber drop, SpaceX is probably right for you. And then, I agree totally with Chad. I think the traditional WISPs are under a lot of pressure. There'll be corner cases where they can still do well. I think that the cellular-based, if you will, fixed wireless, the T-Mobile, AT&T, UScellular, or Verizon, they may have more of a runway than you think because, I take my parents, for example. They're on T-Mobile fixed wireless. They're getting 300 meg. They love it. Fiber came by their house. They chose not to go on fiber because they're like, this works, it's easy. If you look at college kids, if you look at renters, even in dense urban areas, there's a lot to be said for that simplicity, and there's probably a long runway for that. But at the end of the day, fiber always wins. So,
switching to cable for a second, there's been a good old boys club of the John Malones, Brian Roberts, Rocco Camisos that haven't been willing to invest capital in other people's franchise areas. Do you see that changing over time? Will there be real competition between these guys in out-of-market territories?
Absolutely. It sort of has to be. My prior company was owned by, or majority owned by a cable company, and so you're already seeing them start to dip their toe into doing things out of franchise. Over time, even though you can squeeze a lot of bandwidth out of DOCSIS 4.0, they will have to build fiber deeper in and deeper to the node, deeper to the prem. And if you start doing that in territory and you have half a city, why don't you do that in the other half of the city that you don't have a franchise? So yeah, I think we're on that steady drumbeat to seeing that happen.
And I think you've already started to see it with Charter, going out of footprint for RDOF and some of these government subsidies. And so, I think in the beginning here, Charter's going to dip their toe in it and be kind of quiet and try not to, upset the apple cart with like a Comcast, for instance, but might go after smaller cable franchises. But over time, I do think that even Comcast and Charter will be competing in, some of these tier 2 markets directly.
As you stack rank the valuations of these different businesses from wireless towers to fiber, and you look at the multiples, according to James, the copper is going to be at the bottom, but who are the higher order mammals in this stack?
Well, copper's never been more valuable per pound as a commodity. Look, I think you mentioned towers. They continue to be perceived as the best business ever, right? Effectively a permanent asset, a steel monopole, good for 100 years. And the customers on that are investment-grade anchor tenants on 5, 10, 15-year contracts with escalators, CPI, inflation protected. So I think there's a reason why those businesses continue to do well. I think by and large, data centers have been, viewed through a similar lens. Very, very long-lived assets. Different investment grade anchor tenants, but hyperscalers like Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, Google, fantastic credits. And again, signing up for very long-term contracts. Those two categories are almost in a league of their own at this point, just because of the interplay between contract duration, asset life, and credit quality. Everything else is everything else. And I think when you get into everything else, growth matters more than anything. Growth and sustainability of the competitive profile, and that's why you see competitive fiber operators that are vibrant, healthy, growing, trading from the mid to high teens into the 20s as multiples of EBITDA. Cable companies who are perceived to be kind of at threshold market share and declining, trading at 6 or 7 times EBITDA. So I mean those are the extremes, but I think it highlights that in businesses that are truly competitive, you don't have 10-year contracts, they're operationally intensive, capital intensive. That's where the growth dynamics and the sustainability of their competitive position probably matter more than anything.
What I see growing is fiber to the home, and I think fiber to the home in part is because of all the infrastructure capital going into that sector and all the money being spent. The other one is data centers that are doing high performance computing. I mean, if you can get power, you're going to get a customer. Are there any other segments that you see growing at that level?
I mean, again, the fastest raw growth in our ecosystem, certainly the world where we play at Bank Street, is fiber to the home and hyperscale data centers. It's a step function above everything else.
Yep. Let's talk about
touched on it real quick in this session, but I think there may be a secondary kind of derivative growth on the middle mile side of this. I think the pendulum sort of swung away from that from a bit here, but I think there's going to be a need to backfill after you've had all these AI, data centers, all that capacity to go backfill some of that middle mile network.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's talk about the banks for a second, both the bulge bracket and then the regional banks, which seem to be really active right now, supporting some of these fiber to the home companies. What's their temperature these days towards doing deals and backing entrepreneurs and good business plans?
I mean, speaking from the folks that are in our bank group, and we have several of both the national and the regional banks in our debt facility, I think they're happy to lend more capital into quality. Right, if you've got a growing business, whether it's fiber to the home, whether it's enterprise-based, where maybe in the last year or so they had pulled back a little bit. Now, it's just like valuations, right? You pay for quality, but it seems like both the big guys and the more regional folks, again, if you've got a good business, the capital is absolutely available at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say I could chime in just because we've got a portfolio that we're occasionally refinancing, and literally this week on Wednesday we'll call the ball and on commitments on refinancing for Ritter, one of our portfolio companies. But we were very pleasantly surprised by the reception across, I can't remember, 15 or 20 different regional banks supporting this ecosystem. Many of them stepped up or even stepped up well above and beyond what we expected. And so the deal is oversubscribed materially, and we're going to upsize it, and didn't really anticipate that 3-4 months ago when we launched the process.
Yeah, the only downside of that is interest rates are 3 times what they were a few years ago, but.
Yeah, I mean, the good news, though, in my regional bank side is I feel like credit spreads have started to tighten in a meaningful way over the last 18 months. I mean, similarly, looking at our portfolio, where we were getting regional banks at SOFR plus 5 or 5.5, 18, 24 months ago. Now it's 4, SOFR plus 4. I think is coming in line with most of what our portfolio is seeing. But we don't deal much with the bulge bracket guys. I think James might have to be the one to speak more to that. But on the regional bank side, definitely still seeing a lot of appetite. And again, for the quality assets.
What about specialty finance companies? Are you seeing more of them coming in? I know they're more expensive, but.
We're seeing a lot of interest from them. For us at least, it always kind of depends on what the cost of capital is and how much do we want to push leverage. Us at MC, we're very kind of conservative on the leverage profiles in general. Just feel like with the capital intensity of these businesses, when you do go to push leverage, and the other coin that's like on the fiber to the home side, they are still very execution heavy. This is not, it is infrastructure, but this is not a toll road that is a guarantee people are going to use it. You still have to go out there and do the sales and marketing, execute, operate appropriately to get those subscribers. And so we've always been very focused on making sure that the leverage on our business is sustainable, and that you don't put yourself in a tough spot trying to maximize the last dollar of leverage.
Yes, chiming in at that point, I mean, touching on two things you just said, right? The fiber to the home side of it, the securitization market. We haven't touched on that in this commentary, but there's execution risk on this. And I have struggled a little bit with how the securitization market is kind of valuing fiber to the home, as effectively like a toll road, right? And to your point, there's execution risk to this stuff, and I think there's maybe a little reset coming on how they approach these.
Yeah, I think an important thing to note for this audience is that today there are more financing options available for almost any business at any stage of development than there have been in probably for all time, right? So a nascent fiber to the home business can go to regional banks in Texas and borrow on a loan to cost basis, 70 cents on the dollar against construction costs to get off the ground. There's a universe of banks who will step into the company when it achieves positive cash flow and fund it the next part of the journey. That can be traditional banks, it can be private credit funds, Scott, who you mentioned, and at the end of the rainbow, there's securitization, right. At real scale. And at each stage, there's key criteria that matter. There's business needs that can be addressed and spoken for. But I think, above all, and I think this is fundamental to a value proposition of working with an advisor like Bank Street, it's figuring out what does the business need, right? And then overlaying that capital structure and lender relationship, as opposed to just saying, I need X dollars, which can get you into all kinds of trouble if you're not thoughtful about it.
Yeah, we also saw our friend Dan Caruso become a very wealthy man buying distressed companies across the country, aggregating them, and then going public. And now he has what we all want someday, I suppose, is a nice family office. As telecom price compression has been around since Alexander Graham Bell, came up with the first circuit. When does that end? I feel like every other industry I see, continues to increase prices, but we are burdened with price compression year after year. A few years ago, a fiberglass vault was $450. Now it's $800. And so our costs continue to go up, both for fixed assets as well as labor. Yet we are charging less and less. We try to bundle in various services to keep the MRR where it is. But what do you see for price compression going forward the next couple of years in this industry?
Well, being the operator on the panel, I'll just hop in here. Price compression per meg is just a fact of life, right? Because we used to sell gigs, 10 gigs, now it's 40 and 100, kind of goes on up. So I think lit service is always per meg going to go down, but we've always had good luck in any company I've been at in offsetting that with, hey, you needed 1 gig before, now you need 10 gig. If you can hold the price roughly steady, take it up a little bit, that's great. Because you're right, gas is more expensive, labor's more expensive. Where I do think we're starting to see a little bit of a bottom and maybe some stuff swinging back towards the providers is frankly dark fiber. Either kind of small strand count on individual unique routes or some of the bigger hyperscaler type builds. At some point, the price is what it is to build dark fiber. We have had really good luck in getting appropriate escalators and other things into those contracts, where before certain companies are like, I'm never signing an escalator. Now it's like, look, if you want a 10-year agreement on this dark fiber, there's an escalator on the O&M or there's an escalator on the lease. So, we're never going to hit the point where a 10 gig costs no less than, whatever, $500. But again, I think with dark fiber, we're seeing a little more power there.
Yeah, of course, never is a long time, as they say.
Yeah.
I think, though, and Jason, it would be good to have you comment on this. It feels in the commercial fiber, the B2B world, there is a greater degree of discipline today by the providers on capital spending than there has been in 20 years, right? We lived through, looking back, a somewhat dark period with 0% cost of capital causing large players, whether it was Crown Castle or Everstream, Zayo, among others, to go off and do massive anchor anchor tenant deals with low or no returns, right? Fiber to the tower used to be like a 3-year cash-on-cash return business, and somehow it turned into like a 10-year or never. That worked. If you assumed lease up, it worked in a zero cost of capital environment. It doesn't work in the current environment. And I think we've definitely seen across our roster of clients and other relationships much more disciplined capital spending on new projects. And in fact, you also see carriers throwing back bad deals, right? I mean, Crown Castle reported their third quarter numbers last week. They just turned back 7,000 small cells. They said, hey, economics don't work. We're not going to do these projects, and found mutual agreement with their clients. So I think we are in a world where the carriers can be more discerning, more disciplined, and I think the customers on the other side, if they actually want the infrastructure, are going to play ball.
Yeah,
Not like an activist investor to make you more disciplined, right?
That helps.
Well, IRR and ROICs and things like that are suddenly in vogue again, right? Like, can you get a reasonable payback on it? And we can now have, as an operator, a reasonable conversation with another carrier, even really big enterprise customers where, hey, if you want us to be around to maintain this network the way you need it to be maintained, I need to make a reasonable return. And I'll say, by and large, again, carriers, hyperscalers, they get that. They're not necessarily trying to drive every last penny out of cost. They want a good quality provider because, let's be honest, all of them have been burnt by companies overspending on capital, overpromising, and then you get to the end and they just can't deliver, they can't execute. So, we're focused on building a quality operator, quality, operations to make sure we can deliver whatever we're selling to our customers.
I think the key on the enterprise fiber side is making sure that it's going to, whether it be carriers, hyperscalers, enterprises, et cetera. I think you're going to continue to see price compression on the SMB side because, frankly, the small and medium-sized businesses now don't view, symmetrical, 5 gig, 10 gig, whatever, as a differentiator anymore, and are willing to go to the Google Fibers for, $50 a month or that. So if you're going to be servicing the small and medium-sized businesses, you've got to find a way to differentiate away from whether it be Google Fiber or Charter or AT&T, and that could be with bundling additional products or services or starting to move more up market and move more into the enterprise side.
So, Ryan, I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts on this. So I've been knocking on a lot of private equity doors over the years, and they're all looking for, IRRs in the 25% range, yet infrastructure companies are happy with high teens. How is that been a game changer the last few years for companies like yours that, trying to achieve those higher returns?
Yeah, so frankly, it's a good and a bad thing for us. I think there's still definitely a place for private equity in this ecosystem, and how we've played it and how we think about it is more on the smaller end, regional providers and growing those businesses both organically and inorganically. At least in my view, and I'm sure James has a better view on it, but in my view, the infrastructure funds don't want to come in and be very operational and hands-on. They want a very stable business that they can invest and put money behind and see a 30-year time horizon. But some of these companies, when they're $20, $30 million of revenue, require a lot of additional work and professionalization, and that's where I think you can still see the private equity come in and be helpful, and still achieve those those outsized returns as a result of, on the backside, once these are stable, attractive platforms, we're selling at a much higher EBITDA multiple into the infrastructure funds than you maybe would be paying for at the lower end of the scale. So I still very much think private equity has a role in the space, but it is, you've got to be able to go in there and help differentiate these companies, help get them to the scale that infra funds start to think it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. We're in a unique spot, again, when I open my commentary, that we view ourselves both as infrastructure investors and private equity investors and let those lines cross between themselves within our portfolio. And so we look at some, from both lenses there. But if we're talking about the private equity side, I agree with a lot of what you said. This is a very fragmented universe, right? If you talked about the various buckets or sub-industries, and we're talking thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands of companies just in the U.S. of various sizes, obviously, a lot of them small, but that's a lot to pick through. And there's, to your point, it's more complex than just providing capital to a partner, right? There's a lot of operational intensity being on the boards of some of these companies, and there's going to be a lot of winners and losers out there, particularly as you overlay what's going to happen with BEAD and other capital dollars, and that just creates a target-rich environment for people that know the space and have been around it for a while to kind of see the trends that have played out over the years and look for common trends and then applying those to find partners that you can create that kind of value. So I think, yes, bottom line, there's going to be 20+% IRRs out there. They're not easy to find, but I think there will be.
Yeah, and I think as you look to get an infrastructure partner or a private equity partner, it's important to really understand, what is a day in the life of a Portco CEO? Because I had a 28-year-old HBS ex-McKinsey guy sitting in my head every week. So I think if I knew that early on, it would have changed the dynamic, but be that as it may. Kind of a follow-on question to my, question. How do you see the government grants, such as BEAD, middle mile, et cetera, changing the industry multiples in the next few years as this money starts getting dispersed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we, as an opportunity set, are highly focused on BEAD and some of the other state and local programs that are providing subsidy funding. If looking specifically at the consumer broadband market today, I think there's a much greater appreciation on the part of the investor universe, whether it's private equity or infrastructure funds, that competition is real, right? You don't just show up with fiber and people throw themselves at your feet to subscribe to your service. And so as a result, I think we see a larger cohort of the investor and financial buyer universe looking for defensive or protected markets. And some of that can be, a competitive retail business that's, you just get first with fiber, that's great. But BEAD as an opportunity set is really compelling because you're effectively getting our tax dollars that should underwrite what is effectively a broadband monopoly, right? It doesn't make economic sense to build fiber for three homes per mile or whatever the extreme cases are with for-profit dollars. But if you can do it with subsidy dollars, no one else is going to follow you, right? You're going to be not just the only broadband, you're going to be the only true access medium, aside from perhaps satellite or fixed wireless, which is going to be inferior to fiber in those deployments. So to your question, Scott, around buyer interest, I think you certainly see, or valuation impact, you certainly see higher multiples assigned to businesses that have the capacity for higher market share, higher sustained cash flow, and the like. The trade-off, though, is that there's just less embedded growth potential in some of those businesses once the projects are done. So we see investors looking at them almost like a bond, right? You've got an in-place asset, you've got customers generating cash flow. That's it's going to grow at the rate of inflation over time probably, but it's not like a broader business that has much greater growth potential. So at points in time you could see premium, at points in time you can see discount, but it's very compelling, very interesting, but not necessarily a material game changer.
A thesis that a number of infrastructure companies have followed is that it's cheaper to build a fiber-to-the-home network than to buy one, because if you know what you're doing, and not everybody does, you can build a fiber-to-the-home business for 7 to 8 times EBITDA and enjoy the arbitrage of maybe a 13 to 15 times sale price. Is that still true in this higher interest rate, higher cost environment?
I think that spread is still there. I mean, the spread exists, but it's compressed because of the build cost. And I have a somewhat unique view into this because I'm sitting on 4 different ISP boards effectively, but then also a construction board. And it's been fascinating to see the construction costs go up on that side of the equation. And in many cases, they haven't been passed through even to the ISPs because these are long-term contracts. So I think that window is starting to compress and will continue to compress, particularly as BEAD gets laid on, because the supply of labor out there is, I would say, if you backed up 18 months, was definitely constrained. I think it's softened now. I think it's more to a normalized level, but when BEAD comes back in, you're going to have it be very constrained because there's just a limited number of people that are willing to put on a hard hat and sit in the Florida sun and splice fiber. And so I expect those costs will continue to rise as BEAD comes through, therefore compressing that build multiple spread.
And at least at my portfolio companies, we've still been willing to buy assets, even though they're, our creation multiple on the residential side might be at 6 or 7 times, and we might be buying at 10 or 12, but it accelerates our growth plan and accelerates our access to a new market, because especially where my company's focus, which is on long-term contracts with MDUs primarily, that sales cycle is a real thing. So trying to go organically into a brand new market could take 3, 4, 5 years to get real scale. versus being able to acquire somebody and realizing that you might have to pay up for it day one, but it accelerates you 3 or 4 years down the road. That's a trade-off we're willing to give.
It's a very local business too. I know people are building different parts of the country, but if you do that, you really have to have good general management and leadership in that market because it's guerrilla marketing, it's door to door, it's tough.
Yeah, it's got, I mean, just to, Chad mentioned that the spread is narrowing. I mean, if you go back to, the first transaction we did with Metronet, they were best in class building at $600 to $700 per passing. Like, that was real. And at that time, the first Metronet deal was probably valued at, $5,000 per passing. So that was the spread. Today, costs are up. I mean, it costs anywhere $1,000 to $2,000 per passing to build organically. And, fair market value in recent M&A deals has been, $3,000, $3,500, maybe as high as $4,000. So the spread is narrowing. But there's only so much white space, right, to build. So people start thinking more about M&A as a result. And, not everybody has access to capital. So I think that starts driving thoughts of consolidation between and among businesses. So I think that's definitely something we should unpack further here.
Absolutely. Last week we counted 400 different fiber companies out there building today, and a lot of them have designs on becoming sub-grantees. Do you see this industry consolidating similar to what we saw in the LEC business, in the cable business over time, and there just be a few players? I think Kenny mentioned that there'll be a couple national players, but more regional players that will consolidate these industries.
I mean, I don't know that I tend to agree with Kenny. I don't know that it gets down to 3, 4, 5 like the cable companies, but consolidation's natural. I think one of the most interesting things, and we were just talking fiber to the home. If I were a fiber to the home provider, I absolutely right now would be 100% focused on sort of planting my flag, getting there first, doing all that. They have largely ignored, enterprise, government, all the stuff that I do, which by the way is great. We don't want more competitors. But I think over the next few years, you could see fiber to the home companies start buying more pure play enterprise companies like us because we have the middle mile and we serve a lot of those little towns along the way that it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to go build out unless they've already got a drop there. And then B, there's still huge uptake in selling SMB. There's still huge uptake in selling to local enterprises that if they haven't built that, it's kind of hard to do it from scratch. So you could see some interesting bedfellows come together where, or flip side, an enterprise company like us could go buy a fiber to the home company. Operationally, I'm a real believer that those have to, be kept a little separate internally, but having them under one umbrella, looking like a more traditional LEC, makes some sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just think in general, both of you mentioned the increase in costs overall of building fiber. And compressing ARPUs both on the residential side and on the enterprise side to some extent, you're going to have to be able to sweat those assets more.
Exactly.
And that's going to potentially, go back to the convergence of like being both an SMB, an enterprise, and residential fiber provider. And I tend to agree. I don't think this will turn out to be 400 down to 3, but I think over the next 3 to 5 years, that 400 is going to get at least cut in half, and you'll start to see, some clearer mergers. Metronet obviously being one of them already, but that are really like the true kind of best-in-class leaders that will have the ability to go out there and frankly the best capital structures to be able to access that. Metronet trying to acquire somebody using their ABS facility is a whole lot more economically efficient than someone else, that's got a traditional lender that's just a regional bank. Mm-hmm.
So. Yeah, I agree with the general trend of consolidation. It's going to happen. I think there's several analogs. The other one you didn't mention on the wireless side, the regional wireless carriers are a really good example of that. And I spent my early career with Kenny on some of the deals in that space. But I think those were 20 years ago, right? I mean, these things it's a messy path, right? Because you think all these different players, there's kind of natural barriers to how much M&A you can do because you've got to integrate these things, right? And that takes time. And, just the execution of that, I think, is a natural impediment. Because I think sometimes people think, well, okay, we'll just snap our fingers, and in 2 or 3 years, all these things are going to roll up into, 4 or 5 different players, and you just can't do that, right? And then there's seller unwillingness to do that, right? Because there's, pricing and they're, so it's much messier than I think outsiders may project it to be.
Yeah, and I guess from my standpoint, I think you're going to see fiber to the home consolidate much more like enterprise fiber, as opposed to cable or wireless. Cable and wireless had very specific reasons for creating a small number of effectively national providers, right? Roaming in the case of the mobile carriers, mass market advertising in the case of cable. Some of those dynamics don't necessarily play out in fiber to the home. But I think in commercial fiber, right, I mean, we're 4 decades in to consolidation. And there's still, a handful of really large players, but there's, a vibrant community of mid-market and small players. And every single year, there's new businesses that pop up. Bandwidth IG, Summit IG, Solido. Businesses that are stepping up to address specific geographic needs, specific customer requirements. So I think there will be, a long and fruitful consolidation wave in this chapter of fiber. And I guess as a transactional professional, it's
Good to be a banker.
Yeah,
Well,
something we're rooting for.
One more thing Chad said that I don't want to gloss over either about it's messy and it's hard. And again, this will sound a little self-serving since I'm the operator on the panel, but it is hard. Like we've all seen deals that come out that say, oh, we're going to achieve, $100 million in synergies, and it never happens because it's tough. So if you're an investor in this or whatever piece you play in this ecosystem, it all comes down to the people too. And I think you've got to do a lot of diligence on the management teams of, have they done this before? Do they have the right, plan, playbook, et cetera, to go do this? Because whether it's fiber to the home integration, if you're using 2 different type of MIDs or ONTs at the customer site, that's complex, whether it's enterprise fiber, et cetera. And I'm not sure there's just a ton of folks, because there's people like Scott that are getting, out of the industry and going into, investment banking or whatever. You've got to make sure you're, kind of betting on the right people too. You cannot overlook that.
Totally agree with that right there. Amen.
Well, synergies are hard because it's really a fancy word for saying firing people, and that's never easy, so.
Yeah.
So there's a number of business models that are relying on open access revenue. I know it's early innings, but do you see that business model catching on as it did in Europe? And I know Europe's had a lot of subsidies, but what's your view on open access?
I'm pretty negative on it, to be honest with you. I mean, I'll just take a provocative statement here. I mean, not say that it can happen, but I just don't really see it. I mean, there'll be some examples maybe where it might be kind of nichey, but in general, I think the impediments in our ecosystem domestically are just kind of stacked against it. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, from the the network operator perspective, the guys in the company on the tech side, they're just going to be oppositional to this, to just all the fragmentation in our industry, to see that happen that quickly. I just don't anticipate it.
And I think a big piece, at least for me, as we've looked at them, and we've looked at a lot of these open access models historically, and whether or not they're suitable for investment, at least at the private equity level. And I think the only thing that I would say that might help it, I don't think it's ever going to get to like the European model, but certain communities that need this, that are willing to go out and invest in it themselves, and then kind of turn it over to an infrastructure provider. I think that only becomes interesting, at least from an investor standpoint, to the extent that you can get an AT&T or T-Mobile as the anchor tenant. I think that's going to be what's going to help make that a little bit more mainstream, because the credit off taker for the investment professional is credit grade versus a small ISP that you're not sure. Okay, great, they've been able to do this at a small scale, but are they going to be around in 5 years? Are they going to be around in 10 years? And what does that look like? And how do we know that they're going to be able to get penetration rates that will be necessary to return our investment? So I think to the extent that you have T-Mobile or AT&T being willing to underwrite that and stand behind it and have kind of take or pay on these will help drive some of the growth. But to Chad's point, I don't think it's going to be a mass market across the.
Yeah, you may have an SLA with the operator, but if they don't honor that SLA and you're down for 2 days, people have very long memories in this business. But being able to own your asset, control your asset, deal with the end user is a big.
It's a corner case, right? Like it'll work in a couple of really specific spots, but it's difficult to deal with folks. And as an operator, again, you don't want to cede that control to somebody else. And frankly, haven't we already tried this before? I mean, we had unis, we had unbundled dark fiber, with the ILEX, and we saw how that all turned out, right? So, feels like we've been down that path.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think it's important to distinguish with some of the recent announcements between wholesale and open access, because they're not necessarily the same. The T-Mobile joint ventures with Lumos and Metronet are wholesale. with a single anchor tenant, right? There's no intent for T-Mobile to have, AT&T or Verizon on those networks selling against them. Like, why would they want that? And so I think, as Ryan highlighted, when you bring a wholesale network together with a brand name anchor tenant, especially an investment grade anchor tenant who has a multi-year commit and a relatively attractive ARPU, like that actually works. And to the infrastructure universe, right, that is perhaps maybe less creative or less risk tolerant, they look at that as true infrastructure, right? Somebody builds the toll road, and then or the pipeline, and we have our offtake identified, right? Investment grade, anchor tenant, multi-year contract, very straightforward. So I think that, across our universe of investor relationships, we see the greatest degree of interest there, as opposed to, what, say, sci-fi looked like the first time around, or utopia, where you have 25 ISPs selling on an open access network, none of whom are necessarily doing particularly well.
Well, we were asked to leave a little time for Q&A, and I guess we accomplished that by not by a whole lot. So, are there any questions? Anybody wants to ask of our experts up here? Go ahead.
I can wait for the mic, or I can yell.
We can hear you.
Yeah, your earlier question, you just got about government subsidies, fiber to the home, and all that.
Whenever government intrudes in these kind of things, you always end up with the ugliest solution possible. That's just, we've been through this again, in the industry before in 2008, and just made a mess. And a lot of our money was wasted. How do you guys, applying private capital, which is always going to be the best solution because you have so many standards and handcuffs around it, how do you guys look for the right young operator out there? Because I know we're just going to find messes in the fiber to the home market with all the government broadband money coming in. What do you guys look for if someone knocks on your door and says, I have this amazing fiber to the home plan, or whatever it is?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, because I think I've spent a lot of my career kind of riding this line of private capital versus government capital. Across the ISPs that I sit on the board of in the last 5 years, we've received already government dollars totaling over $1 billion. And I anticipate going forward into BEAD, we got a pretty high target on that. And your 2008 example, particularly, I think Clearwave that you guys sold for us, I was part of that. And that was a success story, right? But you're going to have winners and losers here, right? This is going to be both a good story, and there's going to be a lot of winners that come out of this, and some debacles, right? It's going to be waste of government dollars, networks that don't get built, operators that took dollars that they shouldn't have, and then they realize after they built this network that there's actually true OpEx costs to servicing customers in the middle of nowhere, and that's not part of BEAD, right? There's just all these kind of winners and losers going to depend on each state, because the answers are going to be pretty widely varying across states. And so sitting on all these different boards and seeing how all these different portfolio companies navigate through this gives me kind of a lens of, who can do it right and who can't do it wrong, and I think you have to have, operators that have been through some of these cycles before, that have seen them, that are really disciplined, right? They're not just chasing free dollars. They're looking at it from an IRR perspective, and they know the inputs to that IRR equation. Things like, again, the OpEx on the back end. It's not just the build costs. It's what's it going to be to operate the network. So I think it's things like that I would be looking for. But I would be really nervous if, to your point of, kind of a new management team that says they're going to go, get a few $100 million and build a free network from the government. That sounds like a disaster.
Yeah, and look, I think it was said earlier, this is a very local business, and so I think as we look at assessing folks who want to raise capital around these projects, big question is, do you have expertise building fiber in the specific territory, the specific region? Have you done it at scale? Have you done it in low density areas before, or is this like a flyer, your first time? So I think having that proficiency in and around the markets that are targeted, super important. Obviously, validating that there's actually demand. It's not just a bunch of hunting cabins that don't happen to have fiber and will never need fiber. Sorry, are there hunters here that I'm offending?
Yeah, I mean, there's hunters see the internet.
Maybe not in the cab. And then I think the other variable is also ensuring that the team has skin in the game. I mean, we see a number of companies where it's a construction company that goes after the grant, and they can't lose, right? Because they're going to get paid cost plus for the construction, and that's their equity or their matching funds. I think investors that we work with want to see that there's legitimate skin in the game on the part of the folks doing the project. So it's not a heads they win, tails they win situation.
And at least from our perspective at MC, as we think about it, 'cause we see a lot of these business plans and a lot of folks that even have, already received the capital. And it comes down to, in the end, back to the basic principles of like, can you drive a return? Do you know how to build the fiber? Can you do it efficiently? Are you local? But then it's also, in the end, is there a strategic reason for this business after that? And that could be that, hey, it's got a great barriers to entry and you're going to have, really high penetration and strong ARPUs and that can cash flow really well. That could be strategic. Or, the businesses that we tend to like even more are, hey, it's a rural or ex-urban area, but it's close to a market that's attractive, that, over time, you can see why, a future wave of consolidation, they're going to want your asset because you've got, all those things of the barriers to entry, the strong cash flow, but you're also near their footprint already as well, which I think is, at least as we look at it, a big area for, how we diligence our businesses and the potential investments.
Well, the one thing I learned today is when you're allowed to handpick your industry experts for your panel, you get good results. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.